What would you do if you woke up in a completely different world? No money, no family, no future, and 7 strangers were about to become your responsibility. Because that's exactly where Jiang Yue found himself, and somehow, that was the beginning of everything going right. One moment he was riding his scooter home at 3 in the morning, and then a truck hit him, and the world went dark. When he opened his eyes, it wasn't a hospital ceiling above him, it was cracked wood beams in a mud house, so small it barely deserved the name. He was still Jiang Yue, but not the one who'd been grinding 3 jobs just to save 300,000 yuan for a bride price. That version of him was gone, along with everything he'd ever owned. This new world looked like ancient China dirt roads, thatched roofs, rice paddies stretching out to the horizon, and his new life came with exactly the same things the old one had. No parents. No money, no wife. Just a crumbling house, a patch of farmland nobody wanted, and a name borrowed from a man the village already wrote off as useless. But there was something worse waiting for him. Something the old world never had. A war was grinding through the land, and the government was collecting a head tax, 1 payment per person, due in half a month. Missed the deadline and you got conscripted to build city walls. Nobody who went to build those walls ever came back. Yui was still trying to absorb all of this when the village head, Old Wang, showed up at his door with half the village behind him. The government, Old Wang explained, wanted to grow the population. So they'd sent 7 women to the village, and every man was expected to take a wife. Nobody wanted extra mouths to feed, but he wanted extra heads on the tax roll. So the plan was simple: let Yue take all 7. His neighbor Don tried to warn him, said he could barely feed himself, that 7 more people meant 7 more tax payments and certain ruin. But Old Wang sweetened the deal: 30 bags of rice, 1 from each household, plus help fixing the house and labor in the fields. Yue pretended to mull it over, keeping his face carefully neutral. Inside he was fighting back a grin. In his past life he'd nearly broken himself trying to afford 1 wife. Now 7 were coming to him for free with food on top. When the officials dropped the women off along with the rice, Yue finally got a good look at them. They were young, the smallest maybe 7 or 8 years old, the oldest no more than 17. Their faces were dirty, their clothes torn at every seam, and their eyes held the kind of fear that comes from not knowing what happens next. They knelt in front of him without being asked, listing off everything they could do: cook, sew, farm, carry water, anything to earn their keep. Yue's chest tightened. He knew that feeling, the desperate need to prove you were worth keeping around. He told them to get up. No kneeling, not in this house. They were family now. Then he said the words that apparently nobody had ever said to them before: let's eat. The way they stared at the rice pot, like they expected him to snatch it back, told him everything about what their lives had looked like before this moment. The rice wouldn't stretch long with 8 mouths. But Yue wasn't particularly worried. In his old life, he'd studied physics at university, and that knowledge hadn't disappeared when he crossed worlds. He found an old bow in the corner of the house and got to work. Using pulleys he improvised from salvaged parts to convert it into a crude but functional compound bow. While the women gathered firewood, he headed into the mountains with his strange new weapons slung across his back. He didn't notice the 7 pairs of eyes tracking him as he left, or the quiet conversation that started the moment he disappeared into the tree line. The oldest woman, the one who carried herself like she was used to being obeyed, had a small knife hidden in her sleeve. They were already whispering about leaving. But Yue had food to find, and for now that was the only problem that mattered. He pushed deeper into the mountains, testing the bow as he climbed, feeling how the pulleys distributed the draw weight, letting the tension even out across his arm. Halfway up, a fat rabbit froze in the long grass ahead of him. He held his breath and let the arrow fly. It caught the rabbit clean in the neck. His first real kill, and he had to clap a hand over his mouth to keep from shouting. By noon he had 5 rabbits, enough protein for a couple of days. He was about to turn back when he heard something in the bushes, a low, wet sound, too heavy to be a rabbit. He crept closer and found a massive wild boar tearing apart a pheasant, its tusks slick with blood. Every reasonable instinct told him to walk away. He did the opposite. He put an arrow into the boar's side, and the forest immediately became very loud and very dangerous. The animal screamed, spun, and charged, with its tusks aimed directly at his chest. Red eyes, thunder of hooves, the ground shaking under 400 pounds of enraged muscle. Yue stumbled backward, loaded another arrow with shaking hands, and forced himself to go still. 1 shot. When it was close enough that he could see the foam on its teeth, he aimed at the eye and released. The arrow punched through the socket and into the skull. The boar dropped like someone had cut its strings, sliding to a stop less than a meter from his feet. Yue's legs gave out completely. He sat in the dirt beside 400 pounds of dead animal, and breathed until his hands stopped shaking. That had been close, uncomfortably, humblingly close. There was no way to carry the boar alone, so he tracked down some hunters on the way down the mountain, and promised payment to help him drag it back. When they reached the village, the reaction was immediate and satisfying. Old Wu, the veteran hunter, who'd spent years on these same trails, had his pipe drop clean out of his mouth. The other hunters had come back with a couple of thin rabbits and a handful of sparrows. And here came Yue with a boar that required 3 men to move, plus 5 rabbits and a pheasant beside it. People laughed and said, heaven must be giving him one last good meal before he starved. Yue smiled and said he got lucky. 2 men at the edge of the crowd didn't laugh: Wang Biao and Ho San, watching the meat with calculating eyes. They were already working out the math: wait until he sold it, then take the money. Take the wives too while they were at it. Yue had no idea any of that was happening. Back at the house, the women had assumed he'd run. Why wouldn't he? He had nothing keeping him there. Instead, he came back half dead, dragging a boar, and they jumped into motion before he'd even fully crossed the threshold. Boiling water, sharpened knives, cleaned rabbits. The yard smelled like wood smoke, and roasting meat within the hour. He noticed the shift in their eyes. Fear was still there, but something else had moved in beside it. They thought he was a skilled hunter who'd taken 7 wives, because he knew he could feed them. That was a reasonable assumption. It was also completely wrong. This had been his very first hunt. When the meat was ready, all 7 women stood by the fire and didn't move. They stared at the food like it was behind glass. He handed the woman in the blue dress a rabbit leg and told her to eat. She asked quietly if they were really allowed. He understood then, in this world, women ate last. They ate whatever the men left behind. He passed food to each of them and said he'd hunted for all of them. They ate fast, the way people eat when they've been hungry long enough that they don't trust the food to stay. 3 rabbits, the pheasant, most of the boar, nearly everything gone. One of the thinner women started crying and called him a good man. He told her there were no strict rules here. As long as he could hunt, nobody in this house would go hungry. Several of them cried at that, and he realized they probably hadn't heard words like those in a long time, if ever. That night he called the oldest one over the one with the knife in her sleeve, and the quiet authority she didn't seem to notice she was projecting. He told her to wash her face. When she came back, Yue went very still. Under the dirt and exhaustion was a face of startling, almost implausible beauty: fair skin, bright eyes, a stillness that didn't belong in a mud-floor farmhouse. She gave her name as Chrysanthemum, then corrected herself: sure. He put her in charge of the others. She knew arithmetic, which mattered, because tomorrow they were going to the market to sell the boar. They needed rice, clothing, bedding, and most urgently, money for the head tax. 8 people meant 8 payments, and the clock was running. He told her she'd sleep in one of the 2 bedrooms, and he'd take the living room floor. She stared at him, like he'd said something in a foreign language. The man of the house taking the worst sleep spot. That didn't happen here. He was too exhausted to explain, so he lay down and was unconscious in minutes. He didn't know that after he fell asleep, Sure sat with her sister and spoke quietly about him. When he looked at them, she said there was no greed in his eyes, not a trace of it. But she wasn't ready to trust him yet, and she was still planning to run. Before sunrise, they loaded the boar onto a borrowed cart and set out for the market. Sure had smeared coal dust across her face before they left, a smart precaution, because a crowded market was exactly the wrong place for a woman who looked like her to stand out. She mentioned going to markets with her father as a child, then went quiet, and Yue didn't push. When the boar came through the market entrance, people stopped walking. A butcher elbowed his way through and offered 5 silver taels for the whole animal. Yue was half a second from agreeing when Shishir tugged his sleeve and leaned close. What she said in his ear made him step back and hand the whole negotiation to her. She broke the boar down: legs, rib, tenderloin, head, and offered each section separately, explaining which cuts were best for curing, which for braising, which for a fast stir-fry. The merchants started bidding against each other before she'd finished talking. Less than an hour later, everything was sold. Yue counted the coins, over 7 silver taels, 2 more than the butcher's offer. He looked at her with new eyes. She mentioned her father had been a merchant, and she'd learned from watching him. Her expression closed up after that, and the sadness in it told him there was more to that story than she was ready to share. Then a man in silk robes approached Wu Lei, manager of the Yang Trading Company, the biggest commercial house in the region. He wanted a regular supply of wild game. Yue told him they were professional hunters who could deliver consistently. Inside the trading company, he bought rice cloth quilts, 7 sets of women's clothing, salt, spices, and an iron pot, 3 taels and 6 coins after a discount. Half the boar money gone in one transaction. Sure watched him buy clothes for all 7 women and nothing for himself. And for a moment her expression did something complicated. Then he asked Manager Wu for something strange. Refractory clay, graphite crucibles, quenching oil, and blacksmithing materials. Wu's eyebrows climbed. Why would a hunter need those? Yue leaned in and said something quietly that made Wu's eyes light up and sent him rushing to gather everything immediately. Shirshir stared, thoroughly confused and more curious than she wanted to admit. They loaded the cart as the sun moved toward the horizon and took the forest road home. They were barely into the trees when 4 masked men stepped out of the shadows with knives drawn. Wang Biao and Hosan, right on schedule, with 2 hired companions and enough confidence to telegraph exactly how this was supposed to go. They wanted the goods, the money, and Shirshir. Yue stayed calm and put his hands up. He'd anticipated this. Hidden under the cart seat were a bag of ground lime powder and a thick hardwood stick. He told Shirshir to step down from the cart. The look she gave him could have scorched stone. She thought he was handing her over to buy his own safety. The moment Wang Biao reached for her arm, Yue hurled the lime directly into their faces. All 4 men staggered backward, clawing at their eyes, screaming. He grabbed the stick and hit them methodically, not in anger, but with each blow landing exactly where he intended. Don't ever touch my people. Each word timed to a strike. He ripped off their masks, Wang Biao and Hosan, exactly as expected. He took the silver off them, 2 tael, and some copper, the price of their lives, then snapped the stick on a rock and kicked them into the dark of the woods. When he turned back, Shirshir had a knife pointed at him with 2 hands, shaking badly. She'd been terrified and now she was furious. He raised both hands and talked her through it slowly, explaining the lime, the timing, why he needed them close before he acted. She was calming down, stepping forward, when her foot caught a stone. The knife went into his thigh. She went the color of chalk. He told her it was fine, that it was nothing, and almost meant it. She tore cloth from her sleeve and bound the wound without being asked, her hands careful and precise despite the trembling. The bandits hadn't managed to scratch him. His own wife had stabbed him in the leg. There was something almost funny about that. Back at the house, the other 6 women came flooding out, excited over new clothes and quilts and fresh vegetables. The 3rd wife, Chen Lian Yu, spotted the bandage and helped him inside. He told her he'd tripped. Later, Shirshir brought him porridge and asked why he'd covered for her. He told her she was his wife. Why would he blame her for an accident? Something moved in her expression, not quite warmth, but closer to it than before. She said that if he could actually earn her respect, marrying him wouldn't be the worst thing that had happened to her. She didn't believe a poor village farmer could do it. He could see that clearly. What he could also see, though she didn't know he was reading it, she was planning to leave. Take her sisters, disappear before whatever was chasing her caught up to this house. She didn't want him caught in the middle of something he couldn't survive. Meanwhile, by the river, Wang Biao and his men crouched in the dark and planned their next move. This time they'd come at night, with more people, and they'd burn everything down. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Yue lay in bed with a stabbed leg and a bowl of warm porridge, and felt something he hadn't felt in either of his lives, the specific warmth of a home with people in it. That night, after the women had settled, Yue and Shirshir worked by firelight on something none of them had ever seen before. He built an iron furnace from scratch, double-layer walls, spiral air channels running through the body, and a double-action bellows that forced air in both directions simultaneously. Shirshir crouched beside him, asking question after question, unable to help herself. By the following afternoon, he opened the furnace and tilted the crucible. Molten iron poured out in a stream of liquid red gold, glowing so bright it lit the whole yard. Shirshir stared at it in absolute silence for a long moment. She said that the best craftsman she'd ever seen took days to smelt iron. He'd done it overnight. He explained the furnace ran hotter than any normal forge, over 1400 degrees, then used the term Celsius without thinking. She caught it instantly, her eyes sharpened, filed it away. He brushed it off as a technical term, but he could feel her reassessing him from the ground up. She was no ordinary refugee. She understood exactly how valuable this technology was, what it would mean in the hands of the right person. Before this moment she'd been planning to leave. Now she wanted to stay, and that was precisely what he'd been working toward. She also noticed his leg had bled through the bandage while he worked the bellows. She pulled him inside to rebandage it, told him to roll up his pants. He was distracted and pulled too much. She screamed and covered her face, turning bright red. He fixed his clothes and apologized 4 times in a row. When she knelt beside him to apply the medicine, her hands were gentle and slightly unsteady, and a few strands of her hair brushed across his cheek. His heart was doing things hearts shouldn't do during a medical procedure. When she finished and moved to leave quickly, he caught her wrist and asked her to wait. She froze. He let go immediately. He said he just wanted her to come with him to visit the blacksmith next door, a man named Li Dan. She exhaled and walked with him. At Li Dan's house, his wife Xiaowan was mid-argument about wages and the upcoming tax. When she saw Yue, she launched into a speech about how he always needed handouts and never had anything to offer. He put a silver tael on the table. Xiaowan bit it, confirmed it was real, and instantly became a completely different woman. Li Dan felt uneasy about the size of the payment, but Yue told him the work would justify it, then brought him to the courtyard to show him the furnace. Li Dan laughed at the shape of it, all wrong by every standard he knew. Then Yue lit it and ran the bellows and the flames went white. Li Dan's laughter died completely. He said the best forge in the whole county couldn't reach that color. He asked where the design came from. Yue said an old book. Shirshir heard that answer and said nothing. Her silence was louder than any objection. Working with the high-temperature iron from the new furnace, and Li Dan's skilled hands, they forged a dagger by that same evening. The blade caught the light like still water. Li Dan dragged it across stone, and it left a deep scratch without a single chip in the edge. Yue took the finished knife and held it out to Shirshir. She looked at the dagger, then at the leg she'd accidentally stabbed, and asked if he was seriously handing her a weapon. He told her she was his wife and he trusted her. Why would he be afraid? Something in her face shifted, subtle, almost invisible but real. He noticed. That night, trouble came in through the wall. Yue had been deep asleep, when something pulled him awake, a cold pressure on his shoulder. A voice just above, a whisper telling him to get up, that bad people were coming. He opened his eyes and saw no one. He didn't have time to think about it. He moved to the window and looked out into the yard. Wang Biao, Hosan, and two others were already over the wall, moving low and quiet, carrying knives and axes, faces twisted with the kind of anger that had been sitting and fermenting since the road. He needed his bow, but before he could reach it, they kicked open the bedroom door. The women screamed. Blades pressed against their necks. Shut up, stop moving, where is he? Nobody answered. Then Wang Biao's eyes found Shirshir's face washed clean now, no coal dust, her real features on full display. He stopped moving, all of them did. They'd been told the women were plain. Nobody worth much, and now they were staring at someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a painting. They started arguing over her like she was a piece of property, shouting disgusting things, shoving each other out of the way. Shirshir crossed her arms and went pale, but her eyes were steady. There was a fight in them that said she'd rather take the knife than lose her dignity. Wang Biao shoved the others aside and walked toward her with a grin that made the air feel dirty. That's when Yue let the arrow go. It came through the doorway in the dark and dropped one of the men where he stood. Everyone in the room went completely still. Yue stepped through the door, with his compound bow raised, second arrow already seated. The bow that had killed a wild boar at close range. He looked at them and said, what he felt straight down to the bone, how dare you touch my wife, prepare to die. He shot two more before they could process what was happening. The arrows punched through flesh and bone with a force these men had never seen from a bow. One arrow pinned a man to the wall. Another went through a man's shoulder and kept going. Wang Biao finally reacted, not with courage but with cunning. He grabbed Shirshir and pulled her in front of him, a blade at her throat. Yu went still. He had a clear line to Wang Biao's head, but the blade was too close. Neither of them moved. Then Shirshir moved. She drew the dagger he'd given her and drove it into Wang Biao's side. He screamed and swung his arm at her, but something hit him from behind. A stone, thrown hard from somewhere in the room. He buckled. Yue fired. The arrow went through Hosan and caught Wang Biao too, but Wang Biao was wearing hidden armor underneath his shirt. The arrow didn't kill him. He threw himself through the window and vanished into the dark. Shirshir had a small cut on her arm. She was shaking but standing. 3 men were dead on the floor of Yue's house. He moved everyone to another room and began the grim work of cleaning up, his mind already running through what happened. That cold hand, that voice. Before the attack, all 7 women had supposedly been asleep. Someone in this house was hiding more than he knew. The next morning, Lei Dan showed up for work and nearly lost his footing at the sight of the bodies still being dealt with. Yue told him the truth. 3 armed men, 4 including Wang Biao, who'd run. Li Dan shook his head slowly, said the old Zhang Yue had been afraid to kill a chicken. Then he said something that erased the morning's strange victory completely. Wang Biao had a brother. That brother ran with the Wolf Ridge, bandits, the most feared gang in the region, too powerful for the government to touch with normal methods. If Wang Biao reached them and told them what happened, what was coming next would be far worse than 4 men with knives. Before Yue could even decide how to handle that, the officials arrived at his gate. Wang Biao was right beside them, limping and grinning, pointing. He told the officers that Yue had murdered his friends and stolen their silver. The dead men's families came running, crying, cursing, demanding justice. Half the village crowded around and the mood was ugly. Yidan jumped in first, explaining it was self-defense, that 4 armed men had broken in at midnight. Then Yue's wives arrived. The second wife, Xielianyu, stepped forward and spoke clearly and calmly. Nobody breaks into a house at midnight with weapons, she said. Unless they intend harm. Her husband protected his family. The other women backed her up, one by one, each confirming what had happened. The crowd shifted. Everyone in the village already knew Wang Biao's reputation. But Wang Biao had one more card ready. He told the officers that the silver he'd had on him was marked with the character for his name, and that Yue had taken it. Yue's stomach dropped. Wang Biao was right. The marked silver was sitting in his pocket right now. The officer searched him and produced the coins. Wang Biao smiled slowly. He'd won. The officer turned the silver over, read the marking, and his expression changed. It didn't say Wang Biao's name. It said, "I love my wife." Wang Biao grabbed the coin himself. Read it again. His face drained of every color. Yue kept his expression completely neutral and told the crowd he'd had those words carved on all his silver, a reminder to cherish his 7 wives. Shirshir and the others blushed various shades of red. He could tell they thought he was shameless. He could also tell, from the tiny curves at the corners of their mouths, that they didn't entirely mind. He tossed the coins to the officers as a courtesy payment and asked them to investigate Wang Biao for breaking and entering. Wang Biao was dragged away, still screaming that he was being framed, but before the officers left, one of them looked at Shirshir for a long, careful moment and said she looked familiar. Shirshir held perfectly still and said she was just one of the women assigned here by the government for marriage. The officer moved on. Yue filed that moment away somewhere quiet and important. Once they were alone, Shirshir asked how he'd managed the silver trick. He told her the truth. He'd expected Wang Biao to use the marked coin against him. So after building the iron furnace, he melted it down and recarved the surface. A furnace that could melt iron had no trouble with silver. She was impressed, but her expression shifted quickly to worry. She said officials in this era were corrupt and Wang Biao might not stay locked up long. Yue agreed. He told her they needed to finish this problem permanently. She looked startled at first, then nodded once, and said her own experience had taught her that if you leave a problem half done, it comes back worse. Her own experience. He turned that phrase over in his mind. What kind of experience did a 17-year-old refugee have with enemies who came back worse? He asked about the officer who'd recognized her. She told him not to dig into it. She said knowing her secret could get him killed. She and her sister Manman planned to leave before their trouble spread to him. He put his hand on her shoulder and told her she was his wife. If trouble came, he wasn't going to stand aside and watch. Her eyes went red. She turned away and wiped them fast, like she was angry at herself for the reaction. Later he heard Manman telling her sister that he was a good man, and maybe she should accept him as a real husband. Shirshir scolded her. She said the gap between their worlds was too wide, the danger too real. If their secret came out, everyone here would die. Yue stood around the corner, fists tight. They thought he was a poor village hunter who'd be crushed by whatever powerful enemy was hunting them. He made himself a silent promise. He would protect them, and one day Shirshir would call him husband and actually mean it. He had work to do before that day could come. He loaded 20 weapons onto a cart, knives, spears and swords, and brought them to the Yang Trading Company. Manager Wu examined each piece and couldn't stop praising them, running his thumb along edges that barely reflected light. They were so sharp. He offered 500 silver coins for the lot, more than Yue had expected. Yue gave Wu 10 coins as a gift, following Shirshir's advice about building relationships, not just closing transactions. Wu reciprocated by arranging a carriage to take him to a mining area where he might source better iron ore. The mine was run by a young man named Zhou Jin, about 20 years old, well-dressed, and carrying the particular confidence of someone who'd never been told no. When Wu mentioned that Yue was the man who'd hunted the wild boar alone, Zhou Jin laughed openly and looked at Yue's lean frame with open disbelief. He offered a bet, prove it, and get top-quality iron ore for free. Yue pulled out his compound bow. Li Dan had rebuilt it from improved designs, lighter, stronger, more efficient than the first version. The watching crowd stared at the strange weapon. Yue stepped back 100 paces, drew and released. The arrow punched through the target, split it clean down the middle, and kept going. Total silence. Then Zhou Jin did something Yue hadn't expected. He ran forward, dropped to one knee, and begged to become his student. He said he wanted to serve him like a father, that the archery was divine. Yue managed not to laugh. It was mostly the bow. His actual technique was still rough, but he kept that detail to himself. Told Zhou Jin he'd consider it, and drove home with a cart full of the best iron ore in the region. All of it free. He was feeling good about the day right up until the road turned and 9 men stepped out of the trees. Wang Biao was among them, already free, which confirmed everything Yue had suspected about how long a corrupt system could hold someone with the right connections. The man leading the group was big, scarred, and relaxed in the way that people who've done real violence for a long time tend to be. Brother Mozi, Wolf Ridge. They looked at Yue's build and laughed. One said he could kill 10 of him with a single hand. Another said after they finished with him, they'd go visit his wives. Something cold clicked into place behind Yue's eyes. Mozi told him to just kill himself and save everyone the trouble. Said he'd take the beautiful one and enjoy her personally. Yue looked at him and said, anyone who touches my woman dies. But he wasn't empty-handed this time. He'd anticipated this exact situation after the last ambush and had spent part of the previous night building something new, a sleeve arrow, concealed in his cuff, modified with a dual pulley system like a miniature compound bow, far more powerful than anything this era had produced. When the first bandit charged with a knife, Yue raised his hand and the sleeve arrow fired. The man dropped before he hit the ground. The rest came at once. Sleeve arrow for close range, compound bow for anyone farther back. Yue worked both weapons simultaneously, moving between shots, never staying still. The arrows went through them. No armor, nothing to slow the bolts down. 7 men were on the ground in less than a minute. Mosey lost all patience and came with his sword, screaming, closing fast. Yue put an arrow through him, then hit him 3 more times with the sleeve arrow while he was still upright. Mosey fell without making a sound. That left Wang Biao. He was standing among the bodies of 8 men he'd brought here, and his face had gone the color of ash. Yue raised the bow and aimed. Wang Biao dropped to his knees and begged, called him uncle, said he'd serve him like a dog. Yue told him to bark. He did, without hesitation. Then Yue told him one final thing: never think about hurting his woman again. He drew the dagger and it was over. The moment the threat ended, Yue bent forward and vomited into the dirt. His whole body was shaking. In his previous life he'd never raised his hand against anyone. Now he'd done something he couldn't take back, close enough to feel it, and his body was processing that in the most honest way possible. He stood up slowly, wiped his mouth, and stared at the road ahead. Was this world changing him, or had he always been capable of this? He decided the question didn't matter right now. What mattered was keeping his family alive, and that required him to be exactly as hard as the situation demanded. Then a voice behind him: Master, you are so amazing. Yue spun with his hand already on the sleeve arrow. Zhou Jin, the mine owner's son, he'd chased after Yue to exchange contact information and had seen everything from the tree line. That was a serious problem. If word got back that someone had killed Wolf Ridge men, the whole gang would come down on his family. Yue looked at Zhou Jin and asked calmly if he wasn't afraid of being killed to buy silence. Zhou Jin met his eyes and said he believed Yue was a good person who didn't kill without reason. Smart kid, better instincts than his age suggested. Yue told him there was one way to guarantee his silence. One of the bandits was still breathing faintly on the ground. He told Zhou Jin to finish him. Zhou Jin's hands shook visibly, sweat ran down his face, but he understood the logic perfectly. If he was part of it, he could never tell anyone without destroying himself. He drew his knife, closed his eyes and did it. Yue accepted him as a student on the spot. Zhou Jin kowtowed 3 times, eyes bright with something between relief and genuine gratitude. He had his reasons. Zhou Jin's silence was now guaranteed, and the iron ore mines would fuel the weapon business going forward. They cleaned up and left fast. Neither of them knew that on Wolf Ridge, the gang leader had already found the bodies. He was kicking over tables, screaming for answers, face red with a fury that had nowhere to go yet. He sent men out in every direction with one order: find whoever did this and bring back their whole family. The hunt had started, and it was moving toward Dongpo village. That evening, Yue came home and poured 300 silver taels onto the table. The women stared at the pile like it was something from a dream. That was more than enough to cover the head tax for all 8 of them. With enough left to actually live on, he gave them gifts: 2 hairpins rouge, silk fabric, small embroidered sachets, and watched their faces cycle through disbelief, and something that looked a lot like happiness. Then he asked them to properly introduce themselves. First wife Shirshir, 3rd Linji Sha, 4th Zi, 5th Li Ting, 6th Juan, 7th Manman. Shirshir's little sister, 8 or 9 years old, already the most openly affectionate of all of them. He told them all to stop calling him master. No hierarchy in this family, they were equals. After he left that evening, Qin Lianyu told the others what she'd learned from the villagers. The old Zhongyue had been quiet, useless. Couldn't feed himself. No woman had wanted him. Nobody could reconcile that person with the man who built iron furnaces and brought home wild boars. Qin Lianyu said what none of them wanted to say out loud. Maybe this wasn't the real Zhang Yue at all. They couldn't figure it out. But they all knew he was hiding something enormous. That night Yue built a second furnace. The first problem was business, the second was survival. Wolf Ridge was still out there, and Shirshir's mystery danger hadn't gone anywhere. When he finished, Shirshir appeared in the doorway wearing a pink dress, jewelry. A touch of makeup completely transformed from the coal-dusted woman he'd taken to market. She was breathtaking, and she knew it, and she was using it deliberately. She offered to wash his face and asked him to explain how the furnace worked. He saw straight through it. She wanted the technology. She admitted it openly and offered him 1,000 gold pieces as a future promise. He told her he didn't want gold, he wanted a shoulder massage. She blinked, then she agreed. While her hands worked, he told her to call him husband, the modern form, not the stiff old-fashioned honorific. She blushed so deeply it reached her ears, but she said it. Then he pulled her gently down beside him on the sleeping mat. Their faces were very close. Her heartbeat was visible in her throat. He leaned forward, and then Shursher spotted 3 faces peeking around the doorframe. Manman Lianyu and Wani, grinning like they'd planned the whole thing. She shoved him away, called him a rogue in 3 different tones, and fled. He sat there with the scent of her perfume still on his sleeve and smiled at the ceiling. She'd come around, he was sure of it. Over the following days he focused on forging. But one morning shouting broke out in the village. He ran toward the sound and found Old Wu and his wife on their knees in the road, weeping, clutching the legs of 2 officers who were in the process of chaining Old Wu's sons. They hadn't been able to pay the head tax. The punishment was the wall. Old Wu's wife begged them to take her instead. The officers said, old people were too slow, they only wanted the youngs and strong. Yue pushed forward and paid 5 silver taels on the spot. The officers took the money and left without another word. The whole village stared. That was more money than most of them saw in months. Li Dan warned him quietly about flashing wealth in public. Yue told him it was deliberate. Sure enough, Old Wu appeared at his door that same evening. Wife and both sons behind him, carrying dried meat as thanks. When they saw the 2 iron furnaces and Li Dan working at the forge, nobody spoke for a moment. Yue offered them all jobs, 2 silver taels a month each, same terms as Li Dan. Then he was honest. The work was dangerous. People might come, they'd have to fight. Old Wu didn't pause. He said Yufei had saved his family and he trusted him. His sons Zhao Dao and Zhao Yun both swore loyalty without waiting to be asked. He paid them half a month up front and they ate together that night, the table loud and warm. The next morning, instead of going to the forge, Yue took everyone into the mountains. Old Wu looked confused. Weren't they supposed to be making weapons? Yue told him straight. Making money meant nothing if you were dead. He handed out compound bows. Old Wu pulled the string, aimed at a dead tree and shot. The arrow buried itself halfway into the trunk and the old man's eyes went wide. Zhao Dao and Zhao Yun tried theirs and reacted the same way. These 3 were lifelong hunters, far better shots than Yue on natural instinct alone. With a compound bow in their hands, they became something genuinely dangerous. Old Wu offered to teach him proper form in exchange, and Yue accepted without pride. Under Old Wu's guidance, his stance, footwork, and ability to transfer power from his waist into the shot all improved faster than he expected. They hunted together through the morning, bags filling with rabbits and wild chickens. The compound bows made everything cleaner, faster, quieter. Yue was feeling it, the particular satisfaction of working alongside people who were good at what they did. He spotted movement in the brush and assumed another rabbit. A massive tiger exploded out of the undergrowth. He threw himself sideways, but not fast enough. Its claws raked across his back, with a burning pressure that registered before the pain did. He fired the sleeve arrow and hit the tiger's shoulder. It kept coming. It slashed his arm open. He fired again into its belly. It screamed, rolled, and stood right back up. Old Wu, Zhao Yun, and Zhao Dao came running and opened up with their compound bows. Arrow after arrow hit the animal. Blood darkened its fur. It wouldn't go down. It charged Zhao Dao and opened his arm, knocked Old stumbling with its tail. Old Wu shouted for everyone to climb. Tigers couldn't follow. They scrambled for the nearest trees. The tiger didn't chase them. It stayed focused on the smallest tree, Yue's tree. It backed up, gathered itself, and hit the trunk with its full weight. Once, the tree shook. Twice, something deep in the wood cracked. The tree came down and Yue hit the ground hard. The tiger was on him before he could roll, its massive body dropping onto his chest, jaws opening above his face, close enough that he could see every tooth. He heard Old Wu shout his name, helpless from 20 feet up. He had one option left. He pressed the sleeve mechanism against the tiger's belly at point-blank range, and emptied every arrow into it. The modified bolts with their pulley force tore through the animal's insides. The tiger collapsed on top of him dead. Old Wu, Zhao Dao, and Zhao Yun dropped from their trees and hit the tiger with everything they had: knives, hands, bodies, before they realized it had already stopped breathing. They just wanted to save him. They didn't know it was already over. When Old Wu finally rolled the massive body off, Yue was lying under it, covered in blood, barely moving. They asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. His voice was shaking badly enough that none of them believed him. They sat together on the ground, drenched in sweat, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Yue said what had been bothering him since the first moment: tigers don't live in these mountains. Old Wu confirmed it. He'd hunted these hills for decades. Never, not once, had he seen a tiger here. Where had it come from? None of them could answer. Zhao Dao broke the silence by pointing out they were now tiger hunters, which was the highest thing a hunter in this land could be called. Old Wu grinned and said they'd be telling this story for years. Yue reminded them the skin and bones were worth serious money. What had nearly killed him might also make them rich. They dragged it back to the village, and a woman doing laundry by the river looked up, screamed, and dropped everything into the water. The whole village ran out within minutes. Nobody could believe it. Half of them had never seen a tiger even at a distance. Someone ran to tell the village chief. He didn't believe it until he walked out and saw it himself. He stared at Yue battered, clothing torn, wounds still seeping like he was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar man's face. Then they heard hoofbeats. More than 20 of them. A mounted column came hard out of the dust. Someone in the crowd screamed Wolf Ridge. The village went absolutely silent. Leading the riders was a big man with a scar cutting across his face, sitting a black horse like he owned the road. He asked about Wang Biao, his eyes sweeping the crowd and landing. Eventually, on the village chief. The village chief fumbled his answer. His eyes drifted, just for an instant, toward Yue. The scarred man's gaze followed. Yue stepped forward before he could be pointed at. He said he'd had a disagreement with Wang Biao and reported it to the officials. Nothing more. The scarred man looked him over the blood, the wounds, the dead tiger lying in the road beside him. He asked if Yue had killed the tiger. Yes. He asked if Yue knew who might have killed Wang Biao and the others. Yue said he didn't know. The scarred man announced a reward for information and rode off with his column. But as they went, Yue heard fragments of conversation drifting back from the riders at the rear. They'd come back with more men, enough men. Next time there'd be no uncertainty. He gathered Old Wu, Zhao Dao, Zhao Yun, and Li Dan inside with the gate closed. Women watching the perimeter. He told them everything. Wang Biao the road, every Wolf Ridge man who'd come at him, all of them dead by his hand. The room went very still. Old Wu's eyes were the size of coins. Then one by one they told him the bandits deserved it. Zhao Yun and Zhao Dao looked at him the way men look at someone they've decided to follow. Support was good, but it wasn't a plan. Yue told them no more weapons for sale. Everything they made from now on was for themselves. He drew out blueprints while they watched. And they worked through the night. 2 furnaces blazing, iron flowing into molds, Li Dan pouring, the brothers passing tools, Old Wu managing materials. Nobody complained about the hour. By the following day they had new armor, swords and long knives laid out across the courtyard. Old Wu held up a breastplate while Yue swung a sword at it. Sparks flew, but the armor left only a scratch the width of a fingernail. Zhao Dao tested a blade on a rock and split it clean through without chipping the edge. Even Shirshir, who'd seen expensive famous swords in her previous life, stood quietly and said nothing, which was itself a kind of praise. Then Yue showed them the real project. He set it on the table. A repeating crossbow, holding 20 arrows, fired continuously by pulling the trigger. No reloading, no waiting, just arrow after arrow after arrow. Zhao Dao set up a scarecrow wrapped in 2 layers of iron sheet and started moving it around at random. Yue raised the crossbow, tracked the movement, and pulled the trigger. The arrows went through the iron sheeting like rain through paper. Old Wu's jaw dropped. Zhao Yun said quietly that this weapon would change any battlefield it appeared on. Shirshir whispered that she couldn't believe someone could design this. Yue said he'd found the idea in an old book. Shirshir rolled her eyes. She knew he was lying. She kept quiet. Qin Lianyu warned them all. If powerful people learned this weapon existed, they would come for the design and kill everyone who knew about it. Shirshir agreed. Yue told them all this was their hidden card for emergencies only. Old Wu asked him to name it. Yue blurted out continuous shooting big fool crossbow. Everyone stared at him with polite pained expressions. Shirshir frowned and suggested, divine machine crossbow. Yue coughed and said his wife's suggestion was naturally better than his. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly, he noticed. While they trained with the new weapons, the women handled the tiger's body. Inside its belly they found something none of them expected, a gold badge. Not any badge, the badge of the King of Wei, one of the most powerful warlords in the land, commanding an army of 800,000 men, a man powerful enough to challenge the imperial court itself. Shirshir and Qin Lianyu found him in the middle of sword practice with Old Wu, and pulled him aside with faces that killed any desire to keep training. He took the badge, bit it pure gold, and his first thought was that they'd just found a fortune. Then he looked at their expressions and the thought died. Shirshir explained, the king of Huai had been preparing a rebellion for years, accumulating a hidden treasure so vast it dwarfed the national treasury. When the court found out, everyone came hunting for it at once. To protect the treasure's location, the king's men had hidden clues inside gold badges, sealed them inside animals, and released those animals across the land. The tiger that had nearly killed him had been carrying one of those badges in its stomach. That was why it had appeared in these mountains where no tiger had ever lived. It hadn't wandered here by accident, it had been placed. Shirshir made sure he understood what possesses the badge meant. Both the king of Huai's people and the imperial court would kill everyone connected to it. They might raise the whole village just to ensure silence. He told Shirshir and Qin Lianyu to hide the badge, and make sure every woman who'd seen it understood the cost of speaking about it. Then he stood alone with his thoughts for a moment. Qin Lianyu had recognized that badge instantly. An ordinary woman wouldn't know what it was. Shorshur with her noble bearing and merchant's instincts, now Qin Lianyu with knowledge of royal military insignia. Who exactly were the women living in his house? He didn't have time to follow that thread. Because Zhao Yun, Zhao Dao, and Yu Wei loaded weapons onto the cart and headed to town to sell them. At the town entrance, soldiers were checking everyone's documents. An old man near the gate said a high-ranking official had come to the county, specifically looking for someone, and the whole town was locked down until they were found. Inside the county office, though Yue didn't know this, yet the governor of Yunzhou was leaning on the magistrate with barely controlled fury. Two sisters, the Yang Shig's sisters, hadn't left the county, find them or face consequences. A constable named Wu Jian studied the one poster and remembered a woman he'd seen in Dongpo village, dark-faced but similar features. The magistrate ordered 20 guards to seal off Dongpo village immediately. Yu Wei was in town when the soldiers rode past him, heading in the direction of home. He turned the cart around and drove back as fast as the road allowed. He got home to drums and gongs, the village already surrounded. Everyone ordered to the entrance for inspection. Shurshur and Manman were in the crowd. Nowhere to run. The coal dust was back on Shurshur's face, but her hands were completely still. The officers worked through the crowd with their posters, checking faces. When they reached Shurshur, they almost waved her through. Almost. The officer stopped, told her to wash her face. She argued. He drew his sword. She knelt by the basin. When she stood up, the village went silent. Fair skin, bright eyes, cheekbones that caught the afternoon light like something sculpted rather than born. The village chief's jaw fell open. The men who'd happily traded her away for a bag of rice pressed their fists to their chests and stared at the ground. The officer's voice cracked through the silence. "You are Yang Shig." And there it was. Not Shurch Yang Shig, the eldest daughter of the Yang Trading Company, the most powerful merchant family in Jiangnan. He ordered his men to surround her, to arrest her sister, to detain anyone connected to her. The villagers who'd celebrated Yu Wei's silver gift the week before began cursing her for bringing trouble to their door. The officer stepped forward with chains. "I want to see who dares arrest my wife." Yu Wei was standing at the back of the crowd with his compound bow raised. Behind him, old Wu, Zhao Yun, Zhao Dao, Li Dan. All armed, all in the new armor. 20 officers versus 5, and the officers laughed. One with a mole on his face called him trash. Yu Wei drew his sword and cut him down before he finished the word. Blood sprayed across the ground, and the villagers scattered screaming. Then the arrows started flying. Every arrow found its mark. Old Wu's sword hit the spaces their shields didn't cover. Zhao Yun's spear found vital points no conventional defense anticipated. Zhao moved like shadow between blades. Li Dan's axe sent men tumbling. When the officers' swords met theirs, the inferior blades cracked and snapped like dry branches, the difference between 1400 degrees and a normal forge. They cut through more than half before the survivors regrouped and started fighting as a trained unit. Numbers still mattered, and they knew it. Yu Wei made the call. He pulled out the divine machine crossbow. So did old Wu, Zhao Yun, Zhao Dao, and Li Dan. 20 arrows each triggered simultaneously. 100 arrows in seconds. The officers had no answer for a weapon that didn't stop firing. They screamed, dropped, and the village square went quiet. 2 officers were still breathing, badly wounded. They threatened him. Killing officials was a capital offense. The whole village would pay. Yu Wei walked to them and finished it. The villagers were hysterical. They'd doomed themselves. The village chief shook and asked if this was worth it. Yang Shigi stood with tears running and asked the same thing. Yu Wei told her she was his wife. He'd sworn to protect her the moment she became his. He wasn't going to stand by and watch, not in this life. But the real danger wasn't the bodies, it was the villagers. Any one of them could ride to the county and report everything. He made a hard choice. He had old Wu and Zhao Yun seal the village entrance, then gathered every person in the village, men, women, children, and brought out a court flag. He told them to step on it and spit. They resisted. He put his sword to the throat of the first man who tried to rally opposition. One by one, crying, shaking. The entire village stepped on the flag and spat. Now they were all criminals together. Nobody could report anyone without destroying themselves. Then he had Zhao Yun drag out a sack and dump it on the ground, over 1,000 silver taels pouring out in a cascade that nobody in the village had ever seen in one place. He told them the truth. They were all poor. Axixes were crushing them. Their sons got dragged away and never came back. Now they were all on the same side, whether they'd chosen it or not, and he was sharing what he had. 10 silver taels to every family, enough to eat well, buy what they needed, cover the next tax payment without anyone losing a son. The mood flipped like a coin. Minutes ago they'd been cursing him. Now they were calling him a good man, saying they'd follow him anywhere. The village chief watched with a long, complicated face. He knew what had just happened: fear first, then generosity, and now loyalty that would hold because it had to. He told Yue the risk was enormous. Once it was over, Yue told him he already had a plan for the officials. But before he left to execute it, Yang Shi touched his arm and asked if he'd prepared the court flag ahead of time, if he'd known she was in trouble with the authorities, and had gotten ready before it happened. He admitted it. She called him foolish. He said she was his wife, and she hadn't given him children yet, so he definitely wasn't letting anyone take her. She rolled her eyes, but couldn't stop the small unwilling smile from reaching her face. She told him that since he already knew everything, and had committed crimes serious enough to alarm the imperial court, she'd tell him her full story when he got back. He loaded 20+ bodies onto carriages and headed for the county seat with Zhao Yun, Dao Dao and the village chief. His plan was straightforward: report the deaths himself and blame everything on Wolf Ridge. At the city gate, soldiers saw the carriages and the blood and rushed them through without asking questions. Inside, the governor of Yunzhou was watching a performance with a woman in his arms when the news reached him. The county magistrate knocked over his ink brush. More than 20 dead officers. This would reach the imperial court before the week was out. They were brought to the main hall, and Yue put on the performance of his life. Shaking hands, bent back, voice cracking, the picture of a terrified farmer who'd seen something horrible on the road home. He told them they'd been carrying goods when they stumbled on a battle already in progress. They hid and watched Wolf Ridge bandits attack the officers, kill them all, and take 2 beautiful women the fofters had captured with them. The magistrate shoved a wanted poster in his face. Yue studied it with his finger on his lip, nodding slowly. Yes. Those were the women. Exactly those faces. He'd never forget them. Zhao Yun, Zhao Dao, and the village chief fell over themselves, agreeing. Beautiful as angels. Unmistakable faces, definitely carried off by the bandits. The governor slammed the table so hard the teacups jumped. His targets were in bandit hands and over 20 of his men were dead. And now it was all somehow the magistrate's fault for letting things get this far out of control. Yue's story had landed. The blame was on Wolf Ridge. The governor ordered soldiers gathered for an attack on the stronghold, and rewarded Yue's group 100 silver taels for reporting the incident. They bowed and wept with what was nearly convincing gratitude, then walked out of the hall. Outside, Zhao Yun whispered that it had gone better than he'd dared hope. Yue said it only worked because officials that arrogant couldn't imagine simple villagers would lie to their faces. The village chief was quietly stunned at how steady Yue had been in there. Yue gave the reward money to the others, and they headed home. That evening, in the warm light of the house with everyone gathered, Yang Shige finally told them all who she really was. Her name was Yang Shige, eldest daughter of Yang Shichong, known as the richest man in Jiangnan, founder of the Yang Trading Company. The sign above the trading house that had made her cry on that first market trip, it had been her father's. The governor of Yunzhou, Wu Jiuguai, wanted the Yang family fortune for himself. He'd sent soldiers to arrest the family and seize everything. Her father had secret escape routes prepared. He'd gotten Shige and Manman out, then drawn the soldiers after himself to buy them time. A traitor inside the family had given away their location. To disappear, they'd let themselves be swept up with the government-assigned brides. That was how they'd ended up in a mud-floor farmhouse in Dongpo village, disguised in torn clothes, hiding behind coal dust on their faces. That was how Yue had met her. Everything made sense now: the business instincts, the noble bearing, the tears at the Yang trading sign, the way she recognized the King of Huai's badge without hesitation. Little Manman grabbed Yue's hand and begged him with everything she had to save their father. He promised he wouldn't stand aside. But there was a complication in the finance. Wu Juzuoi couldn't touch the family fortune yet. The Yang assets were stored in the gold and silver bank, backed by the imperial court itself. Withdrawing them required all 3 signatories present: Yang Shichong, Yang Shige, and Yang Manman. That was why the governor had been hunting the sisters so desperately. Without them, the money was locked. Their real hope, Shige explained, was a man named Wang Jingru, the Minister of Justice. He was an old friend of their father's, someone their father had helped when he had nothing. Wang Jingru was the only person in the empire with enough authority to take down a governor. Their father had sent them to find him, but Wu Jiuguai had been blocking every path to the capital. She looked at Yue and asked, would he help them reach the minister? He thought it over. The journey was long, the danger was real, and Wu Jiuguai would certainly send people after them. He said he'd do it, but he needed time to prepare properly so the journey had the best chance of success. Yang Shige's eyes went wide. She asked if he was really willing to help them. He smiled and said she was his real wife and Manman was his little sister. Who else would he help? Manman immediately threw herself at him, hugging tightly, kissing his cheek. announcing that she wanted to have lots and lots of babies with him when she grew up. Yang Shij pulled her sister away, laughing and scolding her for not being shy at her age. The room was laughing, and for a moment the danger felt very far away. Yue looked serious and told them both directly. He promised to bring them to Minister Wang Jingrui. Shij held his gaze and made him a promise in return. If he could truly help her reach the minister, overthrow the governor, reclaim the Yang Trading Company, and rescue her father Shi, Yang Shij would marry him willingly. In name and in truth, both of them understood what they were actually saying. They were married on paper, but not yet in reality. Yue told her it was a promise then, and that when the Yang Trading Company was theirs again, he'd arrange a wedding grand enough that nobody in Jiangnan would forget it. The fifth wife, Zhao Wani, swallowed hard and asked quietly. The governor of Yunzhou had real power. Was he truly confident he could bring the man down? Yue put his hand on his chest and said that a man in front of his wives does not back down from a challenge. He meant it as reassurance. The truth was more complicated, and he knew it. But there were people in this room depending on him, and that had a way of making uncertainty feel more possible. At that same hour, far from the warmth of his house, on the road to the Heavenly Wolf's stronghold, the governor of Yunzhou rode at the head of a column of soldiers. He looked up at the terrain with a flat expression. The approach was brutal. The path narrow. Cliffs on both sides. Dense trees blocking every sightline. The magistrate riding beside him described it nervously. Previous attacks had cost them heavily. Rolling stones and arrow volleys raining down on anyone who tried to climb. The governor cut him off. He said these were mountain bandits and they would be dealt with. He raised his hand. The column surged up the slope. From the stronghold above, defenders released stones the size of millstones that crashed down through the trees, snapping trunks, filling the air with splinters and thunder. Arrows followed in volleys of over 100 at a time. The soldiers didn't stop. They pushed upward through the barrage. A young soldier halfway up took a glancing stone to the leg. It shattered the bone and dropped him instantly, blood pouring into the dirt. His comrades stepped past him and kept climbing. When the leading soldiers reached the gate, buckets of heated oil came down from the walls. Men screamed, their skin blistering, weapons clattering from burned hands. The attack had drawn the governor's forces into exactly the battle the bandits wanted. The Heavenly Wolf stronghold had held before and was holding now, but the governor's army was enormous, and the cost of holding was rising with every assault wave. What none of them knew, inside the stronghold or outside of it, was that the real conflict had nothing to do with banditry. It had everything to do with a merchant family in hiding, a gold badge in the belly of a tiger, and a farmer from another world who had already changed the equation. And while armies crashed against mountain walls and governors raged, and treasure maps circulated in the stomachs animals, Yue sharpened his blade, checked his crossbow, and laid out maps. He had a minister to reach, a father to rescue, and a promise to keep. The road ahead was longer than anything he'd faced yet, and he knew it. But he also knew what he hadn't known in his old life, what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. 7 women who'd arrived as strangers had become, in the space of a few weeks, the reason he got up every morning and sharpened his arrows. A girl who'd hidden a knife in her sleeve the day they met now called him husband, and meant more of it than she wanted to admit. A little sister, who kissed his cheek and made embarrassing promises about the future they'd share. Allies who'd sworn loyalty not because he'd paid them, but because he'd treated them like people worth protecting. A governor who thought he'd cornered powerless girls, was about to discover that someone had been building, training, and arming quietly in a mud-floor farmhouse at the edge of nowhere, and that someone had a physics degree, 2 iron furnaces, a repeating crossbow, and absolutely nothing left to lose from his old life. The world that had killed him once had given him everything the first one never had. He wasn't going to waste a single piece of it. Whatever the road to the Minister of Justice held armies, assassins, wolves in silk robes, he would walk it with his head up. Because in this life he had made promises, and Zheng Yue kept his word. The story was just beginning, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, that felt like something to look forwards to.